Wunderkinder in Berlin, Germany. And so, thank you. So, hope you guys had a good lunch too, by the way. So, today I'm going to talk about 3 different areas for helpful automation techniques that hopefully that have helped me in the past that could help you guys. One's about using REST your tests if you have an API that's available to you. Using REST to help shorten your tests, make them less flaky, make them run faster, smoother. Using a proxy to do validations through Selenium. And then lastly, talk about using the Selenium API as a workaround if you ever encounter an issue with your test framework or library that you're using. So I actually chose this picture here because I feel like kind of represents what we have to do as QA engineers or automation engineers. You're constantly juggling a bunch of different tasks. So let's just start with, what's a good test? Writing a good test. You want to eliminate step duplication. Put all your common steps, in your teardown and setups, so you're not duplicating these same steps throughout all your tests. You never want to write your tests which rely on another test to pass. This is very bad because you always want each test to run individually and not rely on another test to execute. You want to write just enough steps to get from point A to point B the quickest way as possible, just to get to your expectation. Eliminate all the unneeded steps, basically. Which is this step. Essentially, you want to get rid of all your steps that have no relation to your final expected result. Just pure steps to get to your end goal, which is point B. So, rest your test. What's good about it? It reduces your runtime. You reduce your steps. By doing so, you limit test flakiness. Not failing on steps unrelated to the test expectation, which I know a lot of automation engineers is like the worst thing ever. It's the most frustrating thing is when test fails or something that's unrelated to what you're trying to test. And in return, you end up writing less code. And by doing so, you could run your tests more frequently as they grow shorter and quicker. You could run them twice as fast. So the bad, complicated or limited API. So depending on your API, if you have one available to you, it could be complicated. It may not offer a lot to you to utilize it in your tests. It can be sometimes difficult formatting parameters or query strings for your JSON requests. All depends which library you use. Some make it easier than others. And then sometimes it could be, depending on which binding you're using, it could be difficult integrating a REST library into it. So let's just go to a first example. So for those of you that don't know what Wunderlist is, it's a task management app where you could create lists and create tasks within Wunderlist or within your lists and then assign them to people. And then you could also, by assigning, you share it to another user. So for this example, we want to validate a shared list notification is received to user A from user B. All we care about is that red area there. We don't care about anything else. We just want to get from point A to point B, and point B is the red box. So there's one way of doing this. It's doing it 100% using UI, going through Selenium. As you can see, I tried to fit the whole script in, but all I could fit in was the actual test steps, because they're quite verbose. There's so many steps you have to go through. First I'm logging in here, creating a list, then I'm sharing the list, then I have to log out, then I have to log back in, and then validate that the shared that actually appears to the user. So let's actually run it now, the long way. in fast motion. If only the test could go this quickly in real life. So see, it was fine. It ran. It was successful, but it took rather long time. It took 74.5 seconds to complete, which I don't know. For me, that's a long time. I don't ever really want a test to last that long. So what's wrong with this example? So we're relying on a lot of UI actions unrelated to the final test expectation. We have to log in twice. We have to then log out. And then we're actually executing several steps that really we don't care about, because all we care about is that end goal of seeing that shared list icon. And then obviously the more tests that you add to your test script, the more chance of failure, because there's cases that are unrelated to the test that you have no control over, like your networking could go down, your computer's memory could run out. So the less tests, the less chances of that happening, or less steps. And you have a longer run time. So let's add some methods to interact with the API to shorten this test. So here I'm creating a list I'm just doing a post, HTTP post, and then I'm gonna do another post to share the list in the API. So by doing that, I was able to eliminate over 20 steps and just have that one method there in the red box to share the list. And then, unfortunately, I still have to log in. It's a limitation with mobile, but like if you were doing it on web, you could also pass in a cookie potentially that auto authenticates you. Then really you only have 2 steps, and your test will like run in maybe 3 seconds. So now let's see how it runs with just doing it through the API. This one's not fast motion. So it executed. So you've probably noticed, like on the web, it was so quick that I actually saw the element that it finished the test and it was successful. So it was good. So it actually reduced a lot for us. So what did we accomplish? We eliminated over 20 UI steps. We reduced the runtime from 74 to 29 seconds. Now we could run it 2.5 times more. And we eliminate a lot of steps unrelated to the final test expectation. So ask yourself, what is the expectation or the goal of the test? For me, for this test, it was get into that one red box. Where can I eliminate steps without losing test integrity? So obviously you want to make a conscious choice if you're doing this, like by adding these API calls, are you going to potentially introduce a bug or miss a bug because of it? So you have to think about it and make sure that you're doing it wisely. So what if you don't have an API? You can ask development to create a private test API for you, or you could develop the API yourself, which I know it's always easier said than done in both cases. So you have some alternatives. You can, if you have access to a SQL library that you can introduce into your test suite, you can make SQL updates to do essentially the same thing. You can set up seed data to run prior to your test execution, but this requires maintenance. So anytime your database fixtures change, you're going to have to change your seed data. So I tend to want to go to the API because I could just do it real time then. I don't have to maintain a separate code base for my test seed data. Okay, so enough on that. We're going on to the proxy integration tests. So last summer, Wunderlist, we released a whole new API, and it was a lot of validation. And we had to find a good way of validating the API without having to like proxy using Charles all the time, or using Wireshark, or a number of different proxies out there, which you would do manually. So I was like, there must be an easy way we could do this using Selenium that will do all our assertions for us. So sure enough, in Ruby, you can. There's a Ruby has what they call a WebBrick. And WebBrick has a proxy built in. So we were able to integrate that into Selenium together to do validations. So the good about proxy is you can validate endpoints. You can validate the JSON body that's returned or sent. You can validate server response is correct, your status code basically. And depending on what your test is, you can use the proxy to validate, full end-to-end integration tests without having to do full end-to-end test. So the bad, HTTPS can be a real pain. So if you have the option to run your test or run your app in both HTTP or HTTPS, try to get it in HTTP if you're doing proxying. Otherwise, you're dealing with certificates, and it could be a hassle. You have to do a little bit of network setup. It's not that bad. And proxy is limited to some things. You can proxy WebSocket connections. There's other libraries to do that, but there's just some cases you just can't use it. So let's just do another test here. Reset password is actually a good example for using a proxy, because what really happens when you reset a password? Like sometimes you just like this here, I got a pop up. Do I really know it did anything? It said it did something. You could do a full end-to-end test where you had a library that goes and checks, like say you sent it to Gmail, and it logs into Gmail and then validates that the email's there. But my opinion, that's not the best way to do the test, because I think that test should remain outside of the UI test. Really, we only care about what the app itself is doing. Like, is the app sending the correct information to the server? And that's for our UI client testing. That's really all we care about. So here we want to check that the method that the request is a post. We want to make sure that the endpoint goes to password reset. We want to make sure that the request body returns, or we send exactly that. And we want to make sure that the status code returned from the server is a 200. And if it returns a 200, I feel pretty good that the client app's doing what it's supposed to do. The server, on the other hand, may not work, but that should be in another test suite, not in your UI tests. So here's an example of the script, and I apologize, it's in Ruby for Java people or other languages. But like I was saying, there's WebBrick, and WebBrick has a proxy server. What I'm doing here is I'm launching the proxy server in another thread, and then I'm starting my Appium instance and loading up the emulator, and then running through all the tests and validating that it returns my expected results that I had before. So let's see it run. So there we go. So the proxy server started, the test went through, it validated that the request was a post, it validated that it went to the correct endpoint, and that the body of the request was correct, and then that the server returned a 200. So now I feel pretty good that the app is doing what it's supposed to do. It sent a password reset request, and we're good. So what are common use cases for proxying, using proxy server in this case? Settings is a good example on apps. A lot of times, like you'll toggle a push notification button or turning off and on emails. You have no clue if they actually work. It's just a switch. It turned on and off. But using a proxy, you could actually validate that action occurred and it worked. Or updating your user data. Sometimes you get no UI response that tells you that it actually updated, where in this case you could actually see that it did. Going back to when we were doing our new API, we could create a whole endpoint validation that every action I'm going through the client app is actually returning the correct endpoint and in the correct status code. And then you can also use it for certain regression tests or integration tests that you don't want to see a full end-to-end. You just want to know that the client app's actually doing what it's supposed to do. So the Selenium API, what happens if you encounter an issue with your test framework or library? It's frustrating because we rely on these libraries and frameworks to help us do our job, and sometimes, just certain cases, especially open source, they update them and certain bugs are introduced, and you can, if this happens, then what can you do? You can submit a bug, which you should do. You could check chat forums. You could possibly downgrade, which is not very fortunate because there may be new features within that version that you're using that you want to use, so downgrading is not always a good choice. You can fix the issue yourself and submit a pull request. Or all is not lost. There's other alternatives. So if you want to you could use the Selenium API as a temporary workaround until your bug is fixed in your test framework or library. So let's get started. So we need a HTTP library. So HTTP party is what I choose in Ruby. It's a gem. You need the WebDriver server URL. It's defined in your caps, or if you use Chrome driver, it's defaulted to that address and port number. And you need the session ID. So it's that long string that you see sometimes if you're ever looking at your WebDriver logs. It's a unique session ID that occurs every time you start a new test. Depending on your bindings, this is retrieved in different ways. And lastly, you want to take a look at the Selenium wire protocol of all the different API endpoints that are available to you. There's almost 100, depending on what your app is. If it's a mobile app, if it's the web, maybe some other touch UI that they've integrated with. I'm not sure. So let's add some examples. So here I added some methods here that are very similar to what already exists, like your find element, your find elements. What else do we have? Click, text, and send keys. So like say for whatever instance, your framework you're using, all of these are broken, which is not likely to happen, but if it did happen, then your workaround is you could just write your HTTP post method or get method, depending on what you're going to do. So here's an example of a script. I just took the same script for reset password, and I'm now doing a bunch of posts and gets to essentially do the same thing. So here's the element strategy that's on that the Selenium API protocol webpage. Tells you how to interact and get the or how to send your posts and gets, and how you format your methods. So you can see here on the test, I'm doing a click once I find an API find using the ID of that locator ID. And then I'm doing pretty much all IDs except the last one. I'm doing it by class name. And you could do obviously XPath, tag name, and all the ones in the left column there. So you could actually also do it in web too. Web's a little bit more tricky, depending on which bindings you use, but it's actually take that back. It's not tricky. Once you know how to get it, it's this simple. You can pass in those methods to get both your session ID and your server URL. And actually, the server URL, because I'm using Chrome driver here, it's defaulted to what the port 9515. So I was going to run this example, but it doesn't really show you a whole lot. So I wrote another example that I'll run live here. We'll start. We'll do it in IRB for those of you that know. So let's go ahead and we'll start our gems, or load our gems. So these who don't know, Appium lib is a nice helper library in Ruby. It has a lot of helper methods built in, which makes it so much easier instead of having to make your own. HTTP parties, how we're going to interact with the Selenium API. RSpec I don't need because I won't be doing any assertions on this, and then colorize just to make it pretty on our print statements. And then can you guys see this? Is this big enough? So here I just, essentially the methods I had in the screenshot before, I just put some puts in there, some print statements just to kind of show you what's happening when it runs. So instead of just running, it's actually going to print out the information. So we'll go here. So now we're going to start our Appium server. Or sorry, our simulator. Load our Appium objects. So let's just start with this find here. If you guys can you guys see that? It's a little blurry, huh? I don't know if that helped much, but so here we're going to do an API find based on our method we had before on using ID value and then value of the ID. So it found it. It was element 0. So let's go ahead and click it. So it found it and then clicked it, just doing a REST call. Oh. So now we'll just speed it up here. Oops. I don't know what that. Did I lose my mic there? Oh, messed it up. So that, and then we'll click our reset. So it's reset. So now let's verify that this pop-up returned the right value. And it did. So we did a get for essentially this text here, and it came back as green. So we can skip this. So here's some useful information and tips. Here all the basic examples that I showed you on this demo are here. You could go to my GitHub and _ Selenium camp. If you're interested in getting started with the Appium, these are some good, helpful sites to look at. The Appium Bootcamp was written up by our very own Dave Hefner. It's actually a really good tutorial. And then there's a couple other documents on Sauce Labs. And then if you are a Ruby user, then Ruby lib in the GitHub is actually a good place to look to. It kind of directs you other documentation. Um, so I utilize a lot of the cloud services because it's just a lot easier to you don't have to maintain anything locally. So if you have the option to, Sauce Labs is a good option. Test Object is good for real devices. And then for CI, I choose Travis because I've dealt with Jenkins one too many times and I've had enough with them. Questions? No questions. Oh, there. Sure. Yeah. Uh, So if you had a special device you needed to use, or uh, yeah. So you need a device in a certain state or with certain software installed on it, or just a particular device. So yeah, yeah. So they're actually with a test object. If you had a device that you had to send your test to, you can request it and they will send ship it and have it hooked up when they have it. Uh, for which my first case, when I was talking about for REST. Sorry, can you repeat the question one more time? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So are you talking about having like an API level test suite? Yes. Yeah. So you have a combination of that as well. So yeah, but not using WebDriver or yeah. So we do have API level tests that we write or I maintain them. Yeah, yeah, totally. You want to do both. You want to do API level tests that test your API at a different level. That's just at the API layer. Um, but this was the test to eliminate a lot of UI steps. So I use the API to rid of all of the UI tests or steps that I don't need because I don't want I want to make the test faster. I want to reduce the chance of it just failing for whatever reason. Less steps make the tests quicker and a little bit more reliable. So it yes, exactly. Yeah, you reduce your flakiness. So hopefully I answer your question. So they're compared to on web. So your question is if you want. Oh, okay. Yes, there are some nuances between like iOS and Android. You can, if your app is identical on both platforms, which doesn't always happen because um, they have different navigation ways of navigating through the UI. So they can't be 100% the same. There's elements are obviously going to be different when you retrieve them, the IDs. Yes, so yeah, so this bootcamp here, APM bootcamp, that it actually has a really good example of how to combine your iOS and Android tests into one suite and share a lot of the code together. So eliminating duplicate code where it makes sense to. So yep, we're already on questions. I guess that is thank you. Oh, sorry. We had one question real quick. So going through all the UI instead of using REST. Okay. No. Actually, it's funny. My colleague would counter that because we had this battle about um, using 100% UI with API. He had some valid um, examples, but most of the examples were web, just the way web works, the way a view may load really quick and close. You don't find it too much in the mobile side, but no, it's actually been great for us. It's helped us our test suite run a lot quicker than what it was doing before when using 100% UI. So I guess that is all. Thank you.